So now we can move on to our webinar. So the webinar today is about bridging the gap, about connecting the social research with the public and policymaker. And basically, this webinar tries to explore how insights from social research can better reach and benefit both the public and policymakers. Social research often produces valuable knowledge, but it happens sometimes, it can happen that it remains locked within the academic or technical circles. It doesn't get kind of like exposed to the wider world. So what we'll try to discuss today is why making research accessible to people matters for everyday life, for policy. What are the risks of not doing so? What are the practical ways to communicate these findings clearly? And we'll try to use examples to show how complex studies can be translated into stories, into visuals, and policy briefs. So by the end of today, we'll explain why bridging research and the public is crucial for evidence-informed debate and policymaking. We'll be able to recognize effective strategies.
Yes, we're a little bit
Yeah.
desynchronized with the slides. It's a little bit harder to.
No. This is fine. Don't
Okay.
This is good. Um, so we'll recognize effective strategies for translating academic findings into clear, engaging formats, and we'll understand how to frame messages for the public and for policymakers because it's slightly different. So basically, bridging the gap between social research and the public involves making research findings understandable and relevant and meaningful to a wider audience. So us as scientists, researchers, we are basically what we would call the knowledge producer, right? So we produce all of this knowledge. We use different methods, scientific methods, to try to understand the world around us, and we produce a lot of knowledge. However, what happens occasionally is that there is this gap between the knowledge producers and the knowledge users. And we think that these knowledge users can be the general public or policymakers. Quite often, what we would want is policy to be based on research findings, on scientific findings, but also we want to make sure that the public, the general public, understands this process as well. In the last few years, there seems to be a bit of a gap that is caused by people's, the general public's kind of um, that has shifted slightly. So the ESS website, we have this project called Kronos, which is collecting the data using the web. And now in Kronos 3, we do it as and paper as well. So basically, if you have a look at this data, we can see a shift in people's attitudes to like people's trust in science and scientists. This shift is basically the middle category. So on a scale from 0 to 10, the category that says 5, which is kind of the middle category, is increasing. And that comes at the detriment of higher kind of levels of trust in science and scientists. So this has been increasing in recent years. And this means that there's been a growing number of alternative explanations for things like climate change, for vaccines efficacy, and so on. And these have a potential to impact our everyday life, right? So like the fact that the general public doesn't trust the research, the scientific findings, doesn't trust the scientists to produce like findings that are meaningful for their lives, has an impact on people's everyday life, but also on the policy decisions that are being made, because the general public are the ones who elect policy makers, right? So this gap between the science, the general public, and the policymakers seems to be expanding and shifting, and we need to find basically a common language. We need to find a language between all of these groups of people that science can be used to support policy decisions to the benefit of the general public. So recent developments worldwide point to the fact that we can't disregard, obviously, the general public. It's very important. We need to find a way to engage them with the findings from science, because they are the ones who actually appoint the policymakers. So the impact is quite large on everybody's kind of everyday's life. And also they're the ones who benefit from the policy decisions. So as researchers and communicators or practitioners, we all share responsibility to ensure that our findings don't remain confined to like academic journals behind paywalls, but instead they contribute to real world understanding and change. So what we want to do today is basically by the end of this session, we want to offer you concrete strategies, inspiring examples, and practical tools that hopefully will help you bridge the gap between research and audiences. So who we are. We were briefly introduced. Thanks, Yuliya, for switching through the slides. We were introduced earlier. So Yuliya and I, we are part of this Infra for Next Gen project, which brings together research infrastructures in Europe. Also, Yuliya and Lisa from CESSDA, they're also part of this project. It's a large infrastructure project comprising like different organizations in Europe, including the European Social Survey, the Generations and Gender Program, the European Value Studies, and a bunch of other organizations and affiliated entities. And basically, we work on this the Next Generation EU recovery plan. We have a project called the Infra for Next Gen, which aims to bridge this kind of difference, basically bring together policymakers, public, and social research. So what we've done, Yuliya, David, and I, we work on the 5 pillars that like the work packages represent 5 pillars, which are make it green, make it healthy, make it digital, make it strong, and make it, I always forget the last one. And basically what we try to do is, what we try to do is bring policymakers into discussions with us social researchers, and also bring the general public. So we have a group like a youth advisory board that is engaged quite often in the discussions of our project. So what we try to do is make sure that the research that we produce and the themes that we investigate, they are actually useful for policymakers, but also in touch with like the general public and with what their interests are and where their kind of what they perceive to be as beneficial for them. So I'm going to pass it on to Yuliya, who will continue to talk about why this gap matters. And
Thanks a lot, Ruxandra, for introduction the topic, and now we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into detail. So let's begin by asking, like, why does this gap matter so much? Let me see with the slides. Yeah, the slides work. So we all know that social research plays a crucial role in understanding society. We learn how people live, we learn how people behave, how people relate to each other. And social research helps us to understand very important topics. It helps us to unpack inequalities, for example, or measure policy outcomes, or design interventions that can actually improve people's life. But as Ruxandra mentioned, too often that knowledge does not reach those who could use it. And when research stays hidden, we can highlight several main things that affect this blockage. So first of all, policymakers make decisions without evidence. And this could be because the policymakers disregard the science or evidence, or just basically because they don't understand what we are talking about, because policymakers are not always scientific experts. Second, the public relies on misinformation and simplified narratives. This is also what Ruxandra already mentioned, that when there is no clear understanding what's happening and there are lacks of explanation, it's way easier to sort of manipulate all the opinions and how we see the reality. And in the end, what's happening, we lose these opportunities for collaborations and innovations that can improve our societies. So basically, the common idea is that the knowledge does exist, but influence does not. So, and this can we can think about, as we all, I guess the majority of us are researchers, can kind of think about many different missed opportunities. And I was thinking giving you a couple of examples. Like imagine you're working in kind of a groundbreaking study on housing insecurities that never reach policymakers. And we know that housing insecurities is one of the most important topic in Europe now. So by locking your knowledge, like the policymakers will never manage to develop a more effective housing programs. Or, for example, research on youth unemployment that would have informed national strategies, but remain blocked behind our journals. What we can imagine, so this is what kind of a baseline, but then we can imagine the alternative. What can happen when research is accessible and engaging? First of all, it can increase relevance and impact of our research. Research that reflects people's voices and needs is way more likely to have real-world application and contribute to positive social changes. Second, when our research is accessible and engaging, it can foster public understanding and trust in science, because open communication can help build public trust, which is vital in the end for addressing societal challenges, because the public in the end can feel informed and empowered at the same time. Third, by making our research more accessible and engaging, we end up with better informed policies rooted in data. So accessible research does help policymakers and practitioners make better informed decisions. Then another important thing, I guess, especially as we are researchers mainly. So in the end, if our research is more accessible and engaging, it gives us visibility, relevance, and the satisfaction of seeing that our work actually creates some changes. And in the end, we end up with kind of real world changes. We can have like better programs, new social initiatives, and more equitable solutions. So the question is, if all the best benefits are so clear, why the gaps are still there? And here I would like to talk about several main barriers. So the first one is jargon, language, and complexity. So academic writing often assumes a specialized audience and it's not written for general public. And simple terms like correlations, methodological frameworks, all these terms, they're very clear for us and for our fellow researchers, but to policymakers and journalists, or to general public, they can be very, very frustrating, and it can isolate the findings from the public, so which in turn leads to lower levels of trust in science and scientists. So the second barrier that we would like to highlight is the format and access. So most research is locked in paywall journals or published in formats designed for academic citation, not for public understanding. And for example, I don't know, if a teacher or an NGO, they would like to use some findings, very often they can't find them, or nowadays, we can see that there is a trend that allows access to an earlier drafts of published articles via different platforms. But again, then we come back to the first issue that I raised is the language and complexity. So the third barrier is limited reach. So this is what I find is very interesting, this kind of idea. So for many researchers, when we work on our projects, publishing a paper is kind of our last step in our project. But publishing a paper is only the first step when it comes to reaching the gap when it comes to kind of bringing the knowledge to policymakers and the general public. So very often it means that research dissemination stops at publication, and it rarely gets promoted, it rarely gets summarized or shared beyond scholarly circles. And the final barrier is mistrust and disconnect. This is also what we already mentioned quickly. So some policymakers view academia as too theoretical. Some communities of people, they feel like research is very extractive and never collaborative. So this makes policymakers and just in general, this makes the communication harder, and it creates mistrust and disconnection. So the challenge here is to ensure that the research speaks to real needs and invites participation, and it means that we need to translate the language we are talking, and we need to translate the purpose of our research so it is understandable what we are doing and what we are talking about. So now let's turn to how we can do that, and kind of in practical, achievable ways. And we would like to share several practical strategies. And the first strategy is storytelling. So as researchers, we have facts that inform, but we need to create stories that connect and make a clear picture. Kind of in social science, I feel every piece of research has a story, because it's always about people, it's about communities, it's about changes, about struggles, challenges we are facing in our societies. So storytelling can help audience remember and care about what we are talking, and it can translate numbers into meanings. So these are kind of basic ideas. So you need to translate findings into human-centered narratives, and you can use stories of people, places to make data memorable. And here there is a simple example of what we could find in our paper. So let's say 30% of residents reported food insecurity. This is how we would write our finding in a paper. But on the right, you can see another way to say exactly the same thing, but definitely in more kind of inviting and general public friendly approach. You can say like 1 in 3 families in our city went to bed hungry last week despite working full-time jobs. So first of all, it's way clearer to remember these numbers, 1 in 3. Then you make it more personal because you're talking, let's say, about our city, so you kind of connect people. And for example, even food insecurity, it can be very clear term for us, but not for everyone. So by saying just hungry, it's way more clearer and easier to remember. The second tool is infographics and visuals, and I believe I guess there is quite a lot of hype around this in general right now. So visuals definitely simplify the complexity of our research. So infographics, data visualization, or even short videos make research immediately more accessible and understandable. And a clear design graphic can do what pages of text can't even do. So it's easier to communicate our findings, like relationships, trends, and even you can kind of bring emotions in your graphics, and then it's way easier to remember what you're trying to say. And here, what we think like the key is simplicity. So usually it's one message per visual. And then nowadays there are a lot of tools that can help even non-designers communicate clearly and their findings and make them attractive. So tools like Canva, Flourish, and Data Wrapper. This is what we use for our findings as well. So, and I have a couple of examples. So when we talk about infographics, I guess a lot of people immediately think about something extremely fancy, but the idea is to make it clear and rememberable. So here's a graph where we wanted to show a gap in voting turnout between low educated people and high educated people. So our idea was to show that the gap is massive. So, and I guess we try to make it like colorful, some pictures, some like these country flags, and to address that the gap is massive. And I think this was a very clear message that brought this graph. Or you can do something a bit way fancier. So as I said, no need to like, it can be a diversity of things. This is what I just found on the internet and I really like it. I guess it's way more fancy and probably challenging to make, but it brings very clear what's happening in the world when it comes to population. And I really like this example. So, and my key message is that when you think about infographics, no need to aim to fancy things immediately. You can start with very simple things, but that are clear, communicate your research message. The next tool that we wanted to talk about is open access publishing. So we know that often our knowledge and our findings are locked sort of behind paywall journals. And so consider using open access journals, institutional repositories. You can share your preprints or working papers. Yes, yeah, you also can write sort of blogs on your personal website, or right now I feel like there is a big trend using LinkedIn where people share a lot their findings, but they make it in very attractive way. So it can be very nice graphics and a couple of kind of screaming theses, but they kind of bring attention immediately. You also can create sort of plain language summaries or executive briefs of your papers, sort of one-page version that extracts your findings and their implications. Yeah, and as I said, like it can be policy brief, it can be short blog post on your social media, on your personal webpage. And remember kind of the main thing here that if you make it accessible, if you make your research accessible, there is a higher chance of impact. The next strategy that we wanted to talk about is the community engagement. So the idea is that instead of researching for communities, we can research with the community. And we can engage stakeholders at different stages of our research. It can be early in defining question or late interpreting findings and deciding how to share the results. So this helps to build trust and kind of turn our participants of our service into advocates. And you can find a lot of ideas. This can be like different workshops, focus groups, even exhibitions, community storytelling. So these are all kind of very powerful tools of engagement that build community trust. And I guess Ruxandra has a nice example here that she wanted to share when it comes to community engagement.
Yes, so I'll tell you about my example in a second, but before that, one other example that I just want to briefly mention is for our project, for Infra for Next Gen project, we have a youth advisory board, which Yuliya kind of chairs, and they meet regularly and they kind of review the project outputs, and they try to kind of, they give us suggestions on how we can make the project more relevant for the European youth, which is basically who the project is aimed at. Another example is this example of translating the Sileti questions in translating the well-being questions in the UK for the Office of National Statistics into various different languages. So one of them was Sileti, the other one was Urdu. Basically, the previous census, so in 2011, identify these pockets in the UK who are monolingual speakers of Urdu or Sylheti. Sylheti is a dialect of Bengali, like spoken in Bangladesh. So there are these people who are, on the grand scheme of things, they're basically 0.5 and 0.4% of the population, but they are mostly monolingual. And they have also been identified as being at risk of having like lower general health, potentially lower well-being. But the problem was that the ONS could not really tap into these communities, right? So we were called in to try to find a way of translating the well-being questions. Not sure if everyone is familiar with them, but basically it's how satisfied are you with your life? How happy are you? How anxious are you? How much do you think that your life is worthwhile living? And basically, these are questions. They're questions that are on a scale from 0 to 10, and they're asked in a lot of surveys in the UK. It's the same questions asked in a lot of surveys in the UK, trying to kind of monitor the general public's well-being at different points in time and in different communities. However, these communities that were monolingual, not only that they were monolingual, but they were also speaking dialects, so like some forms of Urdu and Sylheti and Bengali that are not really the formal language. So whenever the questions were translated, they would usually be translated by a professional translator who would translate into the academic language. So imagine a researcher going to someone's house, asking to interview them and giving them these questions in a language that is, so first of all, speaking to them in English, maybe, showing them these questions in such a way, in a language that would even put them off even more, because it was quite formal, although it was their language, it was a formal way of speaking. So we worked with ONS to try to figure out a way to translate these questions such that the community feels that they are actually being represented and that they're being taken into consideration when designing these questions. When we embarked on the project, we didn't know this, but Sylheti actually does not have a written script anymore at this point in time. So I think there was a script called Nagri Siloti, which used to be used in the past, but now it has kind of like fallen out of use. So imagine trying to translate some questions that are difficult like conceptually they're difficult, but also in a language that does not have a written form. So we ended up working with communities in London who were bilingual, Urdu English and Sylheti English, so that we can try to reach monolingual people to ask them what's the best way to ask these questions. And what we realized is that the levels of literacy were quite low. The levels of kind of like whenever people were asked these questions in a formal way, they would get put off even more. So we came up with a solution together with the community of recording audio like these questions in audio format for the interviewers when they go to the people's houses and they meet a person who is monolingual. They would be actually playing them the audio of these questions in a language that is familiar to them, in a language that doesn't put them off, in a language that doesn't kind of create distance between the research and the person being interviewed, but more kind of like trying to bring them together. Of course, we thought it was a great solution. It was quite difficult to implement, and we had to find the right way of asking these questions. But also, it's a way of bringing the community into the research project, right? And we've spoken with monolingual speakers, and we try to find the absolute exact way of translating these questions such that people can understand what they actually mean and what the researchers are trying to get out of them. So that was my example about community engagement. So basically my conclusion would be that, let's always try to think a little bit outside of the box and remember that the research that we do is meant to serve a purpose. It's meant to bring something to the general public, and involve the community, involve the target audience of our research into the way we produce this research, because quite often we might be surprised at the findings that we find. Thanks. Back to Yuliya.
Thank you, Ruxandra. And while you were talking, there is another example that popped up in my head that I found recently, and I think it's fascinating, and it's a great idea to show that truly you need to think outside of the box. I don't know if you've heard about, but there is this contest, Dance Your PhD. So it's a contest where scientists express their research through dance. So and the idea to indicate by explaining complex theories through dance. And there are several categories like chemistry, biology, and there is social science. And actually, a colleague of mine who finished her PhD this year, she was participating. You just need to record a dance, and then you upload on YouTube. And then there is a rather big competition. But when I learned about this, I was completely shocked, and it's actually quite interesting to watch this kind of things. And this morning I was watching about something laser, hot laser, blah blah blah. Like, wow, never thought about this, but this is a beautiful way, I guess, to just think that there are so many opportunities to talk about your research and engage the community. Okay, and we are moving to the fifth strategy that we wanted to discuss. These are, policy briefs. So a humble policy brief is one of the most effective tools for influence. So usually it's 1-2 pages, rather plain language, and clear, direct, and focused on solutions. A good policy brief usually answers 3 main questions. What's the issue? What does the evidence show? And what should policymakers do? And you can include some visuals, real-world examples, actionable recommendations. And I guess what's also important is not to wait when someone comes and asks you for some recommendations. It's actually you need to put some efforts into distributing it. It can be like conference, meetings, even emails. So there is kind of a bit of personal effort into this. And I wanted to show you one example of policy briefs. This is from the University of Warwick. Actually, you also can check maybe your university does have policy brief series. So this is from this university. It's called Social Science Policy Briefs. You go to the website and they have a ton of different policy briefs on different topics. And what I find quite cool that they already, like on the main page, they have this call for policy briefs, and they just kind of do you want to share your findings? Come and we will help you. So they have templates, and they can help you to draft your policy brief, to edit it. And this is one of the examples that they have on the website. So as I said, 2 pages, very clear and direct language, not much about scientist things. So there is about section, research context section, very short, key findings, conclusion, and the most important thing that we have these policy recommendations just on the first page, very much highlighted, and short, actionable bullet points. I guess these are the 5 tools that we wanted to show you, and we also have a very nice case study that actually kind of brings all these tools in one very interesting story, and Ruxandra will share this story with you.
Yes, so this is a case study. It's basically an example of how, making good use of ways of disseminating information can help research projects. So in the UK, there is this thing called the Universal Infant Free School Meals, which basically it's a program that started in 2014, and It provides free school meals to children in reception, so year zero basically, in year one and year two. And these are children between the ages of 5 and 7. It's a program that was pushed, I think, by the Liberal Democrats, I think, when they were in coalition with the Conservatives. And obviously, if you think about it, it can't be very cheap, right? So around 2019, 2020, there was this chat about slashing this program of free school meals for children aged 5 to 7. So Nuffield Foundation, so the team members, I think they are Dr. Holfer and Dr. Ray. They started working on this project and trying to see what was the impact of this universal infant preschool meals policies. And they tried to, it came at the time of the pandemic. It came at a time when there were, all kinds of cuts and things were, people were trying to kind of save money left and right. And they were arguing, sponsored by the Nuffield Foundation, that these free school meals provisions in the UK should be kept. They wrote kind of this project, like they talked about it, and then this became also a journal article, and later it was disseminated to media as well. But it's a way of showing how a research project that has a massive impact. So in the end, they've managed to show the results. The results of their study shows that. Let me just see if I can tell you that they provided the evidence that high quality school meals for free on a universal basis reduce children's body weight throughout the first year of school. This also is in the context of children's obesity, which is quite a massive problem, I think, worldwide. And in the UK, there have been various different interventions. But what actually seems to work really well is this policy of providing free school meals that are healthy, that are kind of helping all of the children, with their day at school, ensuring that they eat a healthy meal, at least one healthy meal a day. And this is also in the context of the living food crisis, living cost of living crisis, which means that there are quite a lot of families in disadvantaged areas that might struggle to kind of provide children with a healthy meal during their school. So what they found was that the children's body weight throughout the first year reduced. It contributes to a lot of work that is instrumental in these policy debates. They also found that, where are my notes? They found that the take-up of free school meals once this policy was introduced was about 85%. So it moved from 30% to 85% of children kind of taking up the free school meals. It also helped reduce the household food expenditure. It helped with the children's body weight, as I already mentioned. It also, they found there is a link between in the introduction of this policy and reducing the absenteeism in school, which is a massive problem. So basically encouraging children to come into school. And the mediating factor here was the fact that children had to miss school less often because they were less ill. So since the free school meals were introduced, children's kind of health improved and they didn't have to miss school because of being ill. And there's also an indication that it might have helped with attainment. So all of these findings, if they're confined to a journal article, they will have very little impact. But what the team did really well was disseminate this information in policy briefs and in media articles, and basically convey to the general public, but also to policymakers, the importance of maintaining this policy of free school meals. And this was what helped kind of encouraged people to maintain this, policymakers to maintain this free school meals provision in the UK, because they showed that it has such a massive impact on children's lives, and also like extrapolating that to like the family life. So this is just to show that, you know, a well thought out research project that is relevant for policymakers, that is relevant for like general public, and is translated in such a way that it is understood by all of these groups, makes a huge impact on people's lives, and it's very important to continue to do so.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I find this example very beautiful. Like they start as a classical research project, what we all do, but while writing their papers, they like, okay, policy briefs, like short blog posts explaining what's happening. And I guess there were also several podcasts. And then this was a snowball that in the end reached policymakers, and that their research made real effect on people's life. And we also would like to share some resources that might be helpful. So I really like this. The Conversation is a platform where academics share their work in accessible articles. So it's basically a collaboration of academics and journalists translating research findings into general language. And I guess it's a very nice way to learn how to do it. Then there is the Research Impact Handbook by Mark Reed. It's a practical guide to making your work matter. I must say there are a lot of different books. I just highlighted one. Also, there are a lot of policy brief toolkits. So these are basically kind of templates and advice for evidence-based communications. And if you Google, you will find many. So for example, UNESCO has one, World Health Organization has one. And yeah, I think it's also very powerful way to start thinking how to translate your findings. And also don't forget about tools for design and outreach that we already mentioned. For example, Canva, Data Wrapper, and open access repositories like another way you can upload your paper before it's published. So there are a lot of opportunities, and we wanted to highlight several of them. The last kind of final wording that I found very beautiful, and we wanted to share it with you, that when we translate research into stories, values, and collaborations, we build bridges between knowledge and action, between data and people, between evidence and empathy. And I guess this is our main goal as social science researchers, to actually make people's life, not even people's life, our lives of our families, our children, a bit better. So that's it for today. Thank you very much. And we are very happy to answer your questions or hear your reflections. So maybe you also can share some of your stories where you found that it was very difficult to understand what was happening, or where maybe you also have interesting examples how you already translated some of your findings into accessible language. Very happy to hear about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuliya and Ruxandra. It was really very nice webinar. I enjoyed it. If anyone has questions, I think you should be able to raise your hand and then I can unmute you. Or you ask questions in the chat. So we already have one. Okay, so the first question is, can you speak more about the outlets we should choose for the stories?
So, I mean, if you're a student or you're a researcher, start with your own university, because universities do provide a lot of different opportunities. This would be my first kind of thought on this.
Also, I think it's very important. I mean, we know everything that's wrong with social media, but we also know that it's a very powerful tool. And I think it's a great outlet for presenting research that you think might be relevant for people. Also, using social media it's kind of like more specialized social media, right? So like specific groups on different platforms and so on, or LinkedIn, maybe you have a community of people who are kind of interested in the same maybe academic topics as you. It's quite useful to disseminate things to them as well, but make sure that you kind of explain them in a way that someone who, because these platforms are open, right? You want to kind of address everyone. You want to make sure that it reaches people who might be outside of like your sphere of work, right? So if you use the right language and as Yuliya said, like the right infographic or image or something to attract people, that can be very useful and it has the potential to kind of get shared amongst the people, the network, right?
Also, I guess a good example would be so very often when you have a research project, you have to have sort of an advisory board, and then it's up to you who you invite as advisors. So you can create a very diverse group of people who might help you in the future, kind of to disseminate your findings.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Juris, also for your note in the chat. So it's not a question, but a recommendation as well from Latvia. You also write that the importance of clear, accessible language was highlighted. So that's something that's very important. I agree. Jessica wrote, it's one thing creating policy briefings. However, it's not always clear where to disseminate them to reach policy actors. Do you have any recommendations on that?
Yuliya, do you want to go first?
I'll start and probably I get some inspiration. But it's truly a difficult question.
Yeah, so I think sometimes it's worth contacting policy makers maybe at the start of your project and trying to engage them in the development of the project. So this is something that we've done with the Joint Research Center as part of the Infra for Next Gen. And what we found is that it's a really, really useful collaboration because I think policymakers are also in need of, research, right? So they have specific questions, they have specific kind of topics that they're interested in this particular moment. So basically creating these research projects together with the policymakers ensures that they will read your policy brief at the end of the project, Sometimes if their area of interest or of policy is only tangentially related to your interest, to your research, they might read your policy brief but not know exactly how to apply it. So kind of like tailoring the policy brief to what they actually need will have bigger impact on your work as well, I think.
And I also wanted to share our experience here at NIDI. At the end of every project, we host sort of policy brief meetings. And the institute itself, we have this culture to invite people. So it's not like at my individual level, it's more at the institutional level. But then we would invite 20, 30 people from ministers, and then we communicate our findings in an accessible way. So I find it's very, very interesting because often it's not only policymakers, there are some media coming, and it just the idea and the culture at the university or your institute of kind of thinking in advance, what can I bring, what can I do further with my findings? It doesn't stop at my publication. So I guess it's also what would be good to know what's happening at your university, but also I feel it's you who can initiate this idea and like, okay, let's do something.
So another question is, I'm curious if you know how much policy briefs put out by universities are actually read and utilized. Do you know anything about that? Or?
I think we would need our head of media and communications here to answer this question. I think there needs to be a process, right? So I think, we produce the research, we maybe help write the policy briefs, but then we need to find the right way to disseminate this, right? So I think that's why I was saying that it could help to use social media. It can help if you have a media department at your university or at your kind of research institute that might have connections in like the press, like the newspapers or TVs or things like that. But again, I think it's very much about working on the right topic at the right time. So it's really important to, be there when there's like, when your topic of interest comes into the focus of policymakers. It's really important to produce, your results in a way like that that they can use and understand, right? And the public as well. I honestly think that, we were talking about the knowledge producers and knowledge users, and I think it's the public and the policy makers have this kind of like dual relationship. So we produce the research, but the public influences policy and the policy influence publics, right? So it's this kind of like constant impact. Like I don't know, I can't find the right word, but it's constantly kind of like working together, right? Like we know that the way people like something that people want will impact the way policy is made, but also we know that policies have an impact on the general public, right? So it's this dual relationship that's very important. And I think it's very clear that we have to be producing the research at the time when the public and the policymakers are interested in that, right? So as soon as we know that we have this topic that becomes relevant. So, for example, this example with the free school meals, right? There was a lot of chatter about potentially slashing that program in the UK. And this team came up with like the project and immediately did the work, and they knew who to contact, and they wrote it in such a way that it attracted interest from the policymakers and the public, and that led to maintaining that program, right? So it's a little bit of serendipity as well. You have to be there at the right time.
Yeah, and I think media department at your institution is a good hint, and generally try to check out what networks are at your institution, talk to colleagues. Sometimes there are networks you don't know of, and yeah. Thank you also, Audrone, for this very nice resource from Lithuania. I think everyone can see it in the chat, so have a look at it. It looks very nice. Thank you for sharing.
It's nice actually to read that there are a lot of examples that created this enormous impact or uptake.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I would. Yes, there is a question. No, thank you. Yeah, thank you too for your for interest and for also sharing your experiences and your questions. And I'd like to share again the next week's webinar, next month's webinar, because it's also a similar topic, and maybe Vitenis, who will host this webinar, has some more tips. And the datathon, because you will also be able to produce policy briefs, and yeah, we will do what we can in the project to distribute them to policymakers. And as I forgot in the beginning, what's the most important thing? You can also win money in the datathon. So I'm sharing the link again. Here it is. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And thanks for sharing your experiences as well.